Hello, good afternoon. Signed in. This is Dr. Chris Taylor from The Ohio State University, starting our Build Up Dietitians discussion today about research. And wanted to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Getting a chance to sign in. Thanks for bearing with me. This is the first time I've gotten to go on live. So welcome to all those that are joining. So what I wanted to do today is to kind of go over many of the things that researchers get questions about. A lot of times I go to conferences, I present, and I talk an awful lot about data, and I spend an awful lot of time with data, as Roseanne has recently gotten to experience. I am sitting nested directly within my nerdery, so I welcome you all here. I am one of those people that spends a whole lot of time with data. So, so these are the things that when I'm evaluating research, I come with that mindset. But clinicians don't always function within that type of an arena. So what I really wanted to do was kind of talk about the things of what does research really kind of do for us? How can we be good consumers of research? And that's a course that I teach is really about how to be a consumer of research. And then how can we take this information and use it in our clinical practice? So one of the first things I wanted to kind of do was just give you a little background about myself. How did I get to being a professor of nutrition and medical dietetics at The Ohio State University? So I started my path to dietetics a very long time ago. And in fact, in high school and junior high, our cross country coach was one of those people who said you have to have your family life right, you have to exercise, you have to get good grades, you have to have your faith, you have to have all these pieces together that really give you that overarching healthy lifestyle if you want to be successful. And he always told us you can't run a top fuel dragster on low lead gas. So that's one of those things that's really stuck with me all this time. So when I was looking for a career path, dietetics became one of those options that I could explore. So when I changed my major my freshman year, I changed to dietetics, and I thought I am going to be a clinician. I'm going to do clinical dietetics. That's where I'm going to fit. And we had to take that first research class. Everybody sits through research methods, and I sat there going, why do I have to take research methods? I'm not quite sure. I understand why this is important. I want to be a clinician. Why does this matter? Why does this matter? So I graduated. I matched to an internship. I was doing my master's and dietetic internship at Arizona State. And I got matched to a research mentor when I first arrived with a fellowship that I'd received. And all of a sudden, I started working with a lot of data. And it was a scenario where my first project was taking WIC breastfeeding data and really helping the WIC dietitians understand, so who was their client population, who is breastfeeding, who are those patients that are those clients that are less likely to breastfeed, and who are those that are, so they could create some more targeted strategies to increase breastfeeding. So this was one of those really neat kind of projects to start with a mass of data and then address a real actionable clinical question and provide feedback that would then allow them to make an evidence-based approach on how to address things. So that was kind of my launching off into research, lots and lots of data, and then figuring out ways that we could use this information to really help clinicians make informed decisions, working with patients, strategic plans for improving the public's health. So I completed my internship, I completed my master's, I ended up with an opportunity to intern at the National Institutes of Health, National Diabetes, Digestive and Kidney Diseases in Phoenix, working with the Pima Indian population, and really exploring how diet and lifestyle can really impact individuals' lives, and being able to quantify that information, which is, I think, one of those really important things we need to really bolster and support for dietetics practice. So then I went on to get my PhD. I did a bunch of different types of research. So I've done survey design, I've done qualitative analysis, I've done large NHANES dietary analysis and look at dietary patterns. So I've really looked at a whole host of different types of science, and I think this is one of those important things to understand, that nutrition science isn't just clinical dietetics, it isn't just food service management, but it's how all of those pieces kind of mesh together, that we have to identify the person, the food, and then everything around that person and the food experience that is going to impact them, their consumption, and their health outcomes. So that's where research really kind of starts to fill in. So this is one of these pieces that I have really tried to pull together as a professor of diet or medical dietetics, is that I'm teaching clinicians and I'm teaching our future clinicians, our students, how to understand where our advances of science are taking place. How do we evaluate the new and emerging science? Because we keep hearing this new study found this new study found that. How do we determine how well those work? How are they going to work in our situation? And what type of things can we really implement so that we can improve the lives of our patients and clients that we see? So I think it's important to kind of take a step back and think about nutrition as a science itself. Nutrition as a science is really in its infancy compared to many of these other fields. And chemistry dates back to ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek times. So they've really been studying how these compounds exist, identifying compounds, how they interact. And it wasn't until 1926 that the first vitamin was really isolated and defined. So compared to physics, compared to many of these other professions, chemistry, biology, anatomy, nutrition really is in its infancy in comparison. So there are a lot of things that we know and a lot of things that we don't know. So staying up on what's really happening in the science, it becomes exceedingly important for us as clinicians so that we can provide the most cutting edge therapies. So, excuse me. And one of the other things that I think becomes really important is our understanding of research, and a question about how we evaluate some research. I'm going to talk about those and I'll give you some resources as well, is that when you think about healthcare professions, dietitians are really one of the few professions that have a handle on multitude of body systems, beyond or to almost the same level of where physicians have to understand how other body systems. Respiratory therapists, they're really good with the heart and the respiratory system, but they have a tendency to kind of stay within those areas. So a lot of the different professions will be focused on a particular body system, but we really have to understand how all the body systems work together, and then all the behavioral aspects that really influence those when we're dealing with it. So keeping up on science and understanding this then just becomes imperative for how we work forward. And when I work with physicians, they're always asking, so if I could take that one physiologic measure to assess nutritional status, what should it be? But we're really talking about a multitude of nutrients that all act like a drug in the body, and each one of them has a multitude of functions. So we really need to understand what's going on, what is the cutting edge, how do they interact to inform our practice. So why, as a clinician, is it important for you to be able to understand research? Well, research is a fundamental basis for why we do what we do. We are an evidence-based profession. We want to stay an evidence-based profession. And we kind of get lost in the details of research as a whole. And it's not something that should be absolutely foreign to us. And we have to kind of think about when we're evaluating research, it sounds scary and it sounds kind of daunting, but in reality, it's something we should recognize. And this is something we should know. It is ADIME. ADIME is our process to assess an individual, define a problem, a nutrition diagnosis, develop an intervention to address that problem, monitor how that works, and then evaluate how well that worked. If it didn't work, what do we do to modify that process, modify our recommendations for that patient or client, and then evaluate and see if that made things better. That is essentially the scientific research process. So it sounds kind of scary when you pick up that paper and you read it, but in reality, what we're really trying to do is take a look at these questions that we have, many of these clinically oriented questions. How do we really resolve these problems? What are the approaches we can take to address those? And then how does that information then translate into what we know next clinically? And then we just have to put on our thinking caps and think, all right, so how does this apply in my situation? Is this something I can feasibly get individuals to accomplish? And then how would I implement this in my practice and monitor to see if it actually makes a difference? So thinking about a research study itself, thinking about the anatomy of a study. So we pick up this research paper, and now we've been given this scientific, very dense, very high level, filled with jargon kind of document. And what we have to do is take a look at that paper and evaluate it with our lens, the lens that we have as a clinician. So when we read these papers, we're looking at this and saying, all right, so here's a problem that we need to address. How do we address this problem? And they're creating a story in the introduction that says, here's the gap. This is the problem that we're facing. And this is the problem that we need to really kind of tackle. So then the question is, how do we tackle this problem? So they set up and identify the gap. And I kind of look at the introduction as that 35,000 foot view. If you were looking down on what the problem is, what is it that we really know? And what is it that we don't know? So the good research articles will essentially create that story for you and say, here's what we need to solve. This is the problem. So this becomes the thing that you now look at everything else that they're talking about. And what did they do? What did they find? And what does it mean? Should all really funnel down from that core idea from the introduction of what's the gap. So the whole purpose of the introduction is to really kind of put you into that mindset so you know what to evaluate. So then the second part really gets into the methodology. This is the what did they do? Now, I will admit, when a lot of individuals are trained, undergrad, even at the graduate level, they always kind of say, all right, read the paper, read the introduction, and that'll tell you everything that they see as a problem. And then read the results, and then you'll know what they found. But the methods section is really that detailed part that talks about what did they do and how did they get there. So it's really important to know where the results came from. How did they do it? And this is where we really start putting our clinical mind at work. We start thinking through the process of the things that they did. So when we're looking at weight loss interventions, who are the people that they're getting? So we need to understand who are the participants. Where did the participants come from? If they are recruited from flyers, and then individuals have to call in, we then have to consider the fact that somebody looked at that flyer and said, I'm kind of interested in eating healthier to lose weight. Maybe I'll call them. And that then means you have to write down the number. You have to remember where you wrote down the number. You have to call the individuals and have the motivation to speak to a perfect stranger on the phone. So we have different types of motivated individuals that will be participating in these studies. So these are some of those kinds of mindset things that we have to think about when we go through. So the methods of a paper itself is really going to be driven by the research question. Sometimes we just need to understand how um, different factors are related to each other. So maybe we need to understand what those key issues are around weight management before we start developing an intervention to solve individual people's problems. So a more descriptive study is going to help us understand what's going on. And once we understand what's going on, we have a much better idea of what type of intervention to develop. So some of them are going to be much more on that assessment stage of the ADIME scale. So those aren't going to give us definitive answers. And we don't make key recommendations about, so people who eat breakfast are more likely to be normal weight. So that doesn't mean we should tell everyone to eat breakfast, but we see that there's a pattern that emerges of individuals that eat breakfast. So now we need to understand, what's the mechanism behind eating breakfast? Is it an energy management throughout the day? Is that just a symptom of an overall healthier eating pattern? So all these types of things, now we have to understand the steps before we can actually get to that description of causation. So the methods are really those ways that we start thinking about, what did they do and how does this become an actionable strategy that a clinician would take on? One of the things that we see a lot within nutrition is they did an intervention and they gave us the description that says, we did nutrition education. So what does nutrition education mean? Well, that could be standing up and giving a 4-hour lecture. It could be 17-week consecutive education sessions that happen on a weekly basis. And I think we all know what potentially happens when you have volunteers come in 17 consecutive weeks for an hour-long education where we're going to lecture to them and tell them what each nutrient does and which one has an impact on this outcome. So we have to understand the what that they're doing, the details in there, and not just they did an intervention to have them do physical activity or to give them education. So we need to look at the methods of their, so if it's an intervention study, what did they do? How did they carry it out? Who carried it out? Was it a registered dietitian? Were these just health educators? Were these community individuals that were trained? So it'd be really nice to be able to have community individuals providing nutrition education. But what happens when those tough questions come up? How are they going to respond to those questions? So those are the kinds of things that work through our minds as we're reading these. And then how did they collect the data? We know a lot about dietary intake assessment. We know the limitations of a 24-hour recall. We know the limitations of food frequency. We know the limitations of just one 24-hour recall compared to multiples. So when we see how they've collected the dietary data, that's going to give us an understanding of how rigid that data is going to be and how accurate. Because when we're looking at studies and we're trying to evaluate two groups, we're trying to measure, is the measurement at one stage better or worse than the measurement at another? And what we're really trying to do is to get a separation between the two groups to show that one group is better than another group. The quality of the measurement that we take is going to start making these wiggle. So the more variable the data, if we're going to use one 24-hour recall, non-quantitative, now we start adding more. And the more these start to bounce, the more likely we can't tell which group is which and how we're trying to create that separation. So the quality of the data that they're providing us is really going to help us understand the implications of those findings. So the poorer their measurement strategy, and we can look at, if we're looking at self-reported weight versus measured weight, the greater amount of that variability that you're going to see from self-reported weight is going to have an impact on their ability to find an outcome. So looking through the rest of the methods, everyone will get a little bit kind of overwhelmed with the statistics part. even PhDs. I know a lot of PhD RDs that are like, I don't do a lot with stats, that's why I have a biostatistician. So there are some basic kind of understanding of this different type of statistical tests. So if you have two groups and you're comparing means, the two groups would be a t-test. The Academy has some resources that are available that I can share afterwards on ways that you can kind of figure out, are they using, if they're looking at differences in means, it's pretty much going to be a t-test or an ANOVA. If they're looking at percentages, it's going to be a chi-square. So for the most part, those types of things get caught in the peer review process, that you don't have to become a statistician to evaluate them, but to just kind of understand that the stats are driven by the research question, just like the methods are. Then finally, and then next, the results section of the paper itself. The results is really where they start talking about what did we find. So you should find this logical thought process of what's the point? So what did we do to test or to impact that? What's our intervention? So then if we're trying to do lifestyle behavior, to diet, to address a health condition, then we should be looking, our results should be lifestyle and health outcomes from that intervention. So it should follow through fairly well for us as we kind of work our way down through the logical process. So if you can't follow that storyline, this is where those kind of, I found some other things. By the way, our thing didn't work out really well, so we didn't find something. So here's all the other really cool stuff we found. So following that mindset through of what was their point and then what did they find, how well does their data that they collect actually help you answer that? Really helps you kind of follow that funnel process down through to the answer of their question. Then the final part of the paper, when people are reading through, a lot of times this is one of those parts that gets overlooked. It's like, okay, I read the intro, this is what's going to be important. I found out what, I saw their results. In the results section, they're going to describe the highlights, but the tables of the paper actually become the place where you find a lot of the nitty-gritty details. So your those are kind of, sometimes they consider your B-sides. It's like, this is the big thing that we wanted to tell you about, so you can summarize that in the results. But the tables really give you a lot of those details. So then the discussion really allows them to describe, now that we know what the gaps are, what type of information does this really provide for us in moving forward? So what are the limitations of what we've done? What things kind of didn't go as planned? Those are the kinds of things that come up that the good studies will tell you, this is what we know, this is where we are, and this is where we want to go next. And knowing this, the type of study that we had done has these types of limitations. So if we want to continue on to the next step, this is the next thing we need to know. I think it becomes really important to consider. So we've all heard of the diabetes prevention program. The diabetes prevention program was really designed to be a metformin trial versus usual care. And then they said, well, what if usual care was really what it should be and not usual care that says diet and exercise? How should I do that? Well, yes, you should. So they created the lifestyle arm. It was a very intensive trial, lots of education sessions, weekly phone calls for an hour. I know all of you as clinicians have the ability to do that 1 hour phone call with every client every week to really facilitate their improvement. So it was a very effective trial to show, under ideal conditions, what type of lifestyle behavior changes could prevent diabetes and improve weight loss. But we also have to consider, how does that translate into the real world? Those are the kinds of things that don't make it onto the news. They just say diet and physical activity can drastically reduce your risk for developing diabetes and improves health outcomes. So now we have to consider, how do we translate the intensity of that intervention into the type of thing that we could do clinically? So those are the kinds of things you have to evaluate from that discussion and from the results to see how you can translate that into your own world. So there are lots of different ways then that we can kind of think about research and how it helps us as clinicians ourselves. One of the things that we had done recently was I did a continuing education class with some of the dietitian preceptors within our own health system. And they came to me and said, we don't really understand research all that well. We kind of feel like we're being asked to participate, but we don't really know exactly what to do and how we're doing it. So that was the whole premise for us kind of coming together and having a discussion of how to walk through an article, much of the things we just talked about, how to really then look at those critically and say, well, this information is really valid, or this study didn't find a difference, but it was a very poorly designed study and they didn't really seem to provide an intervention that should impact people's behaviors. So that's not a study that I'm going to look at and say there's no evidence to support that approach. So when we were looking at this research, I asked them, I said, so what is it that what kind of research project would you come up with? And they're like, I have no idea. I'd never be able to figure out a research question. I don't know enough. I don't understand research, but what I really want to know about my practice is this. And one of them said, I know I make money and I know I bill for my services through primary care. And they tell me I don't make any money, but I'd like to know how much I do. That's the origin of a research question. And from a QI process, she was able to use the information from the data warehouse, getting anonymous data back on the patients that she saw. So what were the number of patients that she saw? What were the conditions? What type of health insurance did they have? How much did she bill? And how much money came back when she billed it? So it sounds like a very complicated research process, but in reality, I have a question. And how can I use information about what I do to understand what are the outcomes that I really generate? And this was a poster that we had at Fancy this past year that was a result of this basic question to say, I know I make money. And the infrastructure says, no, really, we don't think you do. And what she was able to do was to take the data about their own practice, quantify their outcomes, and say, this is a dime. I see a problem. I know I bill. I don't know how much comes back. So how much do I bring in? And then I take my own outcomes and say, look, I billed this much. These were the payers that paid most. And we brought in more than we make from 1.75 FTEs. The result of that, one new FTE within family medicine to see the patients, because they're already booked out 3 to 6 months. But if they're seen as a process of losing money, it's hard to get more people. But if you can show that you're making money and you use your own evidence, just take that a dime thought in mind. What is it that I do? And what's that impact that I have? Now you have something to say, see, this is what I do. You're more likely to then be able to make those, get those changes happen. So in this case, they got a new FTE and they also got continuing ed funds to be able to bolster the work that they're doing, stay updated and be successful. So this goes from kind of evaluating research papers and kind of trying to sometimes what you just have to do is just get that paper out, read it from a distance, and just say, all right, what's the real thing they're kind of trying to do? What's that overarching idea? Don't get lost in the details, but start thinking about it from a pragmatic approach of how does this carry out? How would you have done it? And then how would this work in my scenario? And are these kind of realistic type of outcomes that I would expect to see? And then we can take those information, use them to help start shaping our own processes for tracking what we're doing, and then use those as our bargaining chip. Because a lot of times we say, just in this situation for primary care, well, you really don't make any money. We're paying for you, and it's a great service that we provide, until you say, see, here's the money we generate. And then you have the argument to be able to say, this is that next step. So there are many resources available through the Academy. If you go to the Academy webpage under research, under the research tab, we have the journal. We have an amazing journal. The evidence analysis library is a great source that has gone through and actually tabulated a lot of these findings for you. And it becomes a great resource, especially if you're moving into a new area, that if you haven't done renal in a long time and now all of a sudden you're going in there, they have recommendations. They've summarized the evidence, kind of pulled it together for you. So you don't have to search quite so hard, but you can really start to evaluate what is there, and then how do they translate those into actionable strategies. So I will post a handful of links onto the discussion part itself. And I just encourage you, if you have questions, ask, continue to stay engaged. I know it becomes a little daunting, but every time you read a paper, it gets a little easier. And read it a little bit, and you get used to the kind of flow, and you get used to the language. And then after a while, the kind of shade goes away, and you're like, oh, okay, well, in this other paper, they did this. And in this paper, they're doing this. And I'm starting to see that the people who did better in this did better in these areas. So the more you practice, the more you will understand. The more you understand, step. So I thank everybody for coming in, listening today at 12:30. It's now 12:30. I appreciate your time, and again, reach out if you have questions, and happy to support our dietitians moving forward.